Right, I've had my Chinese Mini Lathe for just over 7 years now, and during that time I've made several modifications and improvements to it. And I've also tried various different ideas on how to make the carriage assembly much better, to eliminate up and down movement and yet allow it to run smoothly over the full length of the bed. And over the last few days I've had another in-depth look at the carriage assembly on both the Chinese Mini Lathe and the Myford ML7, and this idea and upgrade is the best one I've come up with so far, and I think it's the actual last upgrade I'll ever have to do on this carriage. And it takes a bit of time to do this upgrade, but it's very straightforward to do and easy. You only need a few pieces of mild steel plate to do the job, so it's low cost, and you only need basic hand tools and a bench drill. So if you have a bit of spare time and you're willing to do this job, you'll find it's very worthwhile, and you'll be really pleased with the actual results. Now, in the past I've had very good success with upgrading the back plate here. I did have a brass one on there at one time, and I showed that in another video. I had little success with this front plate, because there's very little room between the apron mechanism and the carriage, so you can't do a lot with that. So my idea was to come up with a new plate which runs in the center section. So the middle plate is held onto the underside of the carriage with two stainless steel cap head Allen bolts, 6mm, and then the plate was ground to the underside of the ways, lightly ground with valve grinding paste, and then shimmed up, and using that method you can get very close tolerances and allow the carriage to run nice and smooth. I've also rebuilt the back section block with a new adjustment, and I'll show this on the bench in a moment. Also, at the back of the carriage here, I used to have a simple locking device to lock the carriage. I've retained that in this plate. I can just use my Allen key and a quarter of a turn, and that's locked solid, and then back off, quarter of a turn, and the carriage will move again. And the new locking device is much more solid than that old one. So just before I show you on the bench, this is what the center slide plate looks like. And that's the shim for the front. So it's a nice, simple, heavy-duty plate which makes contact on either side under the ways, and this section here runs in between the ways. So this is my carriage assembly stripped down. If you have a new Mini Lathe, you won't find these studs on the underside. You'll find two hardened plates like this. And they're held on with Allen bolts, and I've obviously got rid of those and put the studding in, preferably stainless steel, 6mm, and they must be screwed in so that they hit the bottom and are nice and tight. And you can use a thread lock Loctite if you want to. To get them nice and tight, you can put a piece of rough emery around the thread and use a pair of pliers low down and tighten it up like that, so that you actually don't damage the thread where the nuts go. Now, before you put that threading in, mine was in there already, so I haven't taken it out to save time. Before you actually have the studs in there, it's best to leave them out, to do the drilling, and then you can lay this nice and square on the bench drill to do these two 6mm clearance holes. So I used the hole that I'd already drilled for my carriage lock at the back here, opened that out so it's clearance for the 6mm thread. Then I used a drill the size of the, or a bit bigger than the actual cap head in diameter, and drilled down to a certain depth with the stop on the bench drill. Just cleaned up with a flat bottom drill that I ground up to make that nice and square, and the Allen bolt will sit nice and square in there just below the surface of the actual top of the carriage. And at the front of the carriage there's two threaded holes, 6mm threads that are already in there from the factory, and I've sacrificed one of those. These are for the travelling steady, which I never use anyway, and I find that one hole can actually hold my polycarbonate plate, which protects the ways when I'm machining. So like I say, I've sacrificed one of those, drilled it out again to accept 6mm, exactly the same as the back one here, and that one is slightly off center in the actual center of the ways, but it doesn't matter for doing this job. So for the front plate I used the original hardened plate that came with the machine, and I've obviously worked it out now to use shim to give me the correct clearance in between the ways. The shim must be carefully cut so that it's narrower than this section here and doesn't overhang, and I put it in all four places, and this is much more positive than the actual screw, grub screw that they have in the lathe when it's new. And obviously when you have a grub screw in there and you tighten the nuts down or the bolts down, it sometimes actually breaks this hardened plate. So it's best to have shim under it, like I say, and that one goes down onto that. Then I have a stainless steel washer and a nylock nut with a plastic insert, a locking nut. So now I come to the back of the carriage, and I've worked out the shim and put that in there, and I've got two plates which I've obviously cut to the width of the carriage. They're 30mm wide and 5mm thick, and drilled those to suit the studs. And the very important part about these plates here is that I've moved them in towards the centre by an extra 3mm. So I'll just put that one on there like that, and put the original one over the top just to show you. You can see the 3mm overhang there, and that gives it much more surface area contact with the underside of the ways, and makes this a really good solid rigid upgrade. So the other one goes on top of that. You could just have one block on there, but I didn't have the material, so I just used two plates, and I thought, well, it's good anyway, because if the lower one wears in the future, I can just change that. Next, some large washers. I think they're about 25mm in diameter. Then the stainless steel washers, and again the 6mm nylock nuts, and screw those all down nice and tight. So they're all tightened down now, and I say do it up nice and tight because when you turn the carriage over, the shim could slip out if they're not. I have a tight spot on the back of my lathe bed where I put the actual carriage on, and when it's up this way you can obviously loosen these off to get it over that tight spot and onto the actual ways. So now it looks like this, and if you've got it correct, you should have just over 10mm overhang from the actual back of the carriage. I had a very careful look at the underside and on the end here, and I worked out where I can drill two holes and thread them for 2BA, so it doesn't actually break through onto the underside here or into any of the holes. And I've made another block here, and this one is obviously the width of the carriage again. And it's 25mm wide and 10mm thick, and I've milled that slot out there obviously for the slide to go on. If you haven't got a mill, I did this on my other lathe on the milling attachment. But if you haven't got any of those facilities, then you can actually file that one out. And roughly 10mm from each side to the centre of the hole there, I've drilled and tapped for 6mm, and then in the centre of that, the other 6mm threaded hole. And again, this one's drilled with flat bottom drill so that the Allen bolts seat nicely on the end there. So that one screws on the end, and do those up nice and tight. And when you're working out the measurements and the hole sizes or the hole positions on this block, what I did first was put the plates on the underside of the carriage without any shim, bolted them down nice and tight, and then I worked out obviously where the drill holes have got to go, did those, and then that bolts on there like that. When the shim goes in there, you can actually use the stainless steel grub screws to take out any discrepancy at the back here and actually stop that plate from tilting. So now the shim's in there and the 6mm grub screws go down and just nip up very lightly onto the back of that plate, and that will prevent that plate from tilting, like I say, and make that absolutely solid. Plus you have a very fine adjustment which you can actually use to take out a thou or two. Now the middle plate is made from a piece of 40mm wide mild steel plate times 8mm thick, and the piece that screws on top of that is 25mm wide by 10mm thick, and I've deeply countersunk that. Threaded this one here for 2BA, and that one screws on the top in the middle with two 2BA stainless steel countersunk screws, and screw those up nice and tight. So that one looks like that. So when that's all screwed together like that, you have to find out the positions of the two holes here for 6mm threads, and that's for the locking bolts. And you do that by putting the carriage back on the lathe, feed the new plate down through the ways until it's flush with the end face, check that it's in the center of the ways, and then use a transfer punch on the front one, take this one out again, drill and tap that for 6mm on the bench drill, slide it back down again, put the first Allen bolt in and nip that up, and then use a transfer punch on the back one, and then you'll have it in exactly the right position. And then, like I say, I just for keeping that one correct and putting it in right each time, I stamped front on that one. So then I use the two stainless steel Allen bolts. They're 30mm long, and screw those ones down. And I've worked that out what shim I need on the front. I don't use shim on the back because that's my method of actually locking the carriage. So I cut a piece of shim, and there's enough room just to feed that down in the front and then tighten that one up. And when you first do this, you want to like a couple of thou clearance at least. And what I did was use my grinding paste, the valve grinding paste. Like I say, I did it on the underside of the ways on the middle here, and lapped it in until I got it a nice smooth movement all the way down. So after it's lapped and ground in there, make sure you clean the ways thoroughly underneath and under the actual carriage. And this one just locks down and then is released by about 1/4 of a turn. And that one's a lovely nice tight fit now, runs smoothly. I haven't oiled it up yet. And I shall try that one out in the coming months. And if you're doing upgrades like this, you want to make it easy for yourself. I've shown this in another video, but you want to take off all the screws on the back guard. In this hole here and this existing threaded position, you put a piece of 4mm threaded studding which is protruding about 3.5 inches. The guard just goes down over that one, and then I have a brass nut which is threaded right the way through with a pipe inserted in the front of that, flared at the end, and I can actually just reach behind with my hand, feel with my hand. I could actually do it with my eyes closed and screw that one on nice and tight. And then at the front I have another nut which just screws into the hole behind the chuck back plate, and that one screws the guard on nice and tight, saves a lot of messing about, and you can actually just quickly take it off whenever you want. So now I have the lathe reassembled again and everything tidied away, my polycarbonate cover on the front here, and the clock on here for a test, and giving a lift on the front. I have about 2 thou movement, up and down movement, and on the back I have absolutely 0 movement. Yet I have a nice full travel of the carriage along the bed, nice and smooth to operate. So I think that's a really good upgrade to do on the Chinese Mini Lathe. And now I'll do a test cut on steel just to see how it performs. So I'm very pleased with that, and I think if you do this upgrade you'll be very pleased with it as well.